Thank you very much. Really nice to be here and great to be associated with the launch of the college course today. I've obviously been asked to some extent to articulate what the challenges that we face at Arcadis and actually what that means for the wider industry. And I also want to bring insights from some of the work which I've been doing with the Construction Leadership Council and some research work which I did for BIS a couple of years ago around supply chains and how they work and what that means for the wider industry. So what I'm going to describe today isn't just focused on the needs of consultants, but I think the way that consultant organisations are evolving actually tells us quite a lot about what's happening in the industry and the wider set of skills. So just a couple of things about Arcadis. I don't need to do much about brands. Arcadis is of course bringing together quite a lot of different capabilities in the UK. We have a legacy consulting business, EC Harris, legacy engineering business, Hyder. We're part of a much larger business in around the world. Don't need to worry too much about that. But I think there's a few things that starts to tell you about the way in which clients engage with construction. Firstly is that they want to start blending skills together because that's how they get to the outcomes that they're looking for. And secondly, that we need to start looking at different forms of assets in different ways. So our exposure, for example, in the infrastructure market is very much more now about actually using existing infrastructure, making that more effective. How do you sort of reconfigure that? And that starts asking different questions about how you use your money. And I thought it was really interesting, Stephen's point about from a money value point of view, we think construction output's going to increase by 2.5%. But one of the things that we try and do within Arcadis is that we try and save money for clients so they can build more. So if we take clients like, for example, some of our sort of banking clients, what we do is we try and drive money out of the process so we can actually do more activity. So an awful lot of what's going to be coming forward over the next 5 years, 10 years and such like is people working together in collaborative ways to increase the productivity of the industry, and that will require different skills, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Again, I think the other thing is just also to start recognising there's some increasing complexity of organisations. Now we work in collaboration and joint venture with a lot of other design delivery organisations, and the stream of things that we start to do in terms of how we relate to these different clients. Let's say, for example, education and children's services. We don't just build schools anymore. We are sort of, in some instances, actually delivering entire school services because that's what people want. And I think, again, if one thinks about the business model for all construction organisations, whether they're specialist contractors, whether they're large contractors, FM organisations, they're going to need to configure themselves in a way that delivers ultimate value to the client, because otherwise we can't really achieve our objectives. So I want to first look at three challenges, and the first one, it's an obvious one, but it's probably the most complicated of all, is this one about productivity. And the reason why I think this is so relevant to the training agenda is that if you imagine if we flatlined in terms of output on a per capita basis for the last 20 years, then that sort of creates a whole challenge about, well, if we want to expand, then we inevitably hit what you might describe as limits to growth, which are related to access to people. Now, elsewhere, as illustrated by that graph there in terms of manufacturing, those limits to growth have been broken. They've been broken through investment in plant materials, new technologies, or just by some people thinking about how they reorganise themselves in terms of different supply chains, lean manufacturing, lean construction and such like. But that requires a different set of skills. So it's not just the sense of we need more of the same people, because if you need more of the same people, and this is the relationship between, for example, between bricklayers and the homes built, it means you actually end up delivering less because you've hit a physical constraint. So one of the sort of, I think, the big points that we need to face ourselves is we continue doing the same kind of stuff. For example, not building houses like those over there, then we will inevitably have this result, which is we do less. We are more expensive, we cost our clients. And one of the things that I do in my life is I do quite a lot of analysis around markets, And certainly we know at the moment that construction costs are going up by probably 5, 6, 7% more than CPI. And you say, what other industry could go to its client base and say, we are X amount more expensive than the background economy, and expect people to say, thank you very much, that's a good value proposition. So that really eats the heart of what we do. And just taking a piece of work which we did last year, which we called People and Money, looking at the housing market, just representing the way which we build houses at the moment, it creates an idea to hit the sort of targets that government wants us to hit by 2020. We need to introduce something like about another 135,000 people simply to build houses. It's not going to happen, so we need to start thinking about doing things in a different way. So that means then we need to think about how we meet changing client need. And this is something which has been central to the way in which my part of the legacy business, EC Harris, has thought for probably 10 years. We've taken this thinking into the wider Arcadis, not only just in the UK, but globally. In terms of thinking about it, we need to start thinking about the way that clients don't just want, say, for example, something to be built. They need it to be planned. They then need to reposition it over a period of time. They may actually be more concerned about operating assets. If one thinks about the water companies now, they've pretty much built everything they're ever going to need. They're now about reconfiguring it, operating it as effectively as possible. So this requires a very different set of skills. And I'd say it's not necessarily a set of skills in a particular point, so a particularly clever planner or a particularly clever asset manager. It's how these people start to work together. And if I take the example of sort of asset management propositions that we put together, and I use asset management because I think it sort of challenges our assumption about what construction markets might be. You start to see things, we've got all of these questions about risk, around disputes, service charges, so operating costs, value and such like that. Those are all going to be delivered by lots of different people blending these things together. Now, I recognise that that's slightly different from, let's say, for example, a bricklayer collaborating with somebody doing finishes or building services and such like. But in reality, it's the same kind of thing. It's different skill sets being brought together in different ways. So that model there might be the equivalent of, let's say, some kind of off-site fabrication, a new way of providing a service and outcome to a client. And that's what we have to do unceasingly as a business to be able to achieve our growth targets, profitability and such like. And Peter's point around BIM, I've had a little bit to do about BIM over the last 5 years. I've been involved in the BIM task group. And what the BIM agenda starts to open for everybody, so that's not just consultants, but constructors, operators, is this sort of like long-term value generation bit. We call it organisational performance, social performance. The areas where actually you might be able to secure real profit, real benefit by delivering something better to clients. So the classic example is, well, what happened if we made a hospital more efficient? So if we actually enabled patient outflow to increase, and we somehow had a stake in that as a constructor or as a designer or an FM organisation, well, maybe actually some of the savings that came from that would come through to the industry, or it would mean that we could treat more people and that would create opportunities elsewhere. And this kind of space, which is moving into where the costs associated with operation and people, and then how people operate within one another, is certainly where we need to go. And I think probably everybody within the industry, within a period of time, i.e. those that we're training now, need to start thinking within not just a design, build, operate environment, but also in terms of thinking about performance. So in terms of how do we do this, and I sort of coined this phrase, and I made it up yesterday. So I think is what we're doing is we're putting what you could describe as core skills into new arrangements. So when we face off to our graduate recruitments, and currently we're recruiting something like about 120, 140 graduates. We've got about 80 year-out placements, people like that, and we're looking at about 50, 60 apprentices this year. We still talk about these things like building surveying or business advisory or engineering and mechanical engineering. So we're still talking in the language of conventional silo-based thinking. And I'd like to think, because we do quite a lot of delivery stuff as well, we'll have some construction managers in there. We'll have people who are actually on site remediating environmental contamination. But those skills, I think we're starting to reorganise in a different way. So we're asking people to apply their skills as systems engineers. So basically sort of coming back from, rather than thinking about, I'm a mechanical engineer and I'm going to develop a system, I'm trying to think about, well, what's the functions we've got to meet first, and then from that, then I'll come up with a solution. Or we've got people who are starting to think about how you configure designs to align with forms of off-site manufacture and how you bring them together on site. So it's same skills, but we're asking people do different things. And that's the really interesting and exciting bit. And from a recruitment perspective, it's quite powerful. There's a really interesting piece in the Financial Times yesterday about millennials and their reaction to some of what you might have previously described as really attractive jobs. So the jobs in the city or the jobs in law. And it was what it was basically describing, that offer of really hard work, grind through your early years and such like, but actually no longer necessarily with the certainty that you've got massive kudos of being in an attractive industry and lots of money. That's actually sort of wearing out. And some of this idea of actually having jobs that are engaging, changing, is quite powerful. And I see this through work that I do with the Duke of Gloucester's Awards. I do that on behalf of the Construction Youth Trust. And we see this, these are the young achievers. And you see people demonstrating, well, firstly, they came through quite a lot of barriers to into the industry. They didn't understand it. But when they get there, they created really good opportunities. And the idea that you could ask a young person to respond to, well, can we blend together asset management and some data validation and verification? Yeah, they'd respond to that. So I think that's the opportunity. But of course, the challenge is how we create the skills and the abilities to do that. Now, I don't think that is just relevant to consulting business like mine. So this is picking up some stuff which I did for this biz work, which was looking at the structure of supply chains about 3 years ago. And we did a lot of engagement with people down at second tier, and we were asking questions about what were the performance drivers around actually either holding back achievement productivity or alternatively making people better. Now, 3 were commercial, so were the things you'd expect: payment, the way people are appointed, the kind of contracts they're operating in. But fascinatingly, 3 of them were absolutely people skills. They were design management, so the decision making to make things coordinate properly, site management and supply chain integration. And what came clearly out of the findings of that piece of work was that these were the skill sets that were neglected. So the bits that bring parts together create massive dependencies. So the site management skills, when you've got upwards of 70 trades operating or 70 suppliers operating on a single project, the value of £20 million or such like, critical dependency, and yet not necessarily recognised and pushed as hard as they could be, and therefore really dependent on the ability of that individual rather than the capability of the industry to deliver something consistently. Similarly in design management, again, the ability of people to review and organise themselves, and in this business around supply chain integration, people even recognising the complexity they've got on a project by project basis. So where does that take us then? Well, I think it takes us to this interesting model of, well, we probably focus a little bit too much on this technical bit, project management bit, but these areas of leadership and strategic business management, in this instance promoted by Project Management Institute, are really, really important. And I think we should forget leadership can be at the level of the gang, or it can be the level of just the small bunch of people around a group of desks saying, let's do things in a slightly different way, rather than actually being the people right at the top of the pyramid. So I think that this of core skills organised in a different way is really critical for us going forward. So I thought I ought to come up with some solutions. I'm not going to say they aren't solutions, but they point in a particular direction. I think in the apprenticeship one, I think it's fair to recognise that apprenticeships are going to become an increasingly competitive space. We're all over it. I'm sure KPMG are all over it, and it's in that sense of an industry's right to win in this space, I think, will become increasingly challenged. What we're finding is the issue that construction has is the sense that it is seen as being vocational in a way that even bizarrely law is not seen as being vocational. Law is a transferable skill, but construction skills, design, engineering are not seen as transferable. So people have to commit early. And so that would be one of the things I'd say to, if you want to increase that flow there, is that message around transferable skills is probably the most important one around actually parents' concerns rather than necessarily the students. So that's the second one. And this one here, and it's interesting, is I think is the key one, is we're losing so many people so early. And so much of the language of, as you'll see in a moment from Construction Leadership Council, is about next generation skilling. But we've got a whole lot of people who leave the industry at a ludicrously early age, early 50s, before they're 60, and all of those skills are being lost. And it's partly because of what you might describe as an old manual model of ways of working, rather than thinking about, well, what other things do we need people to do? So that would be, I think, our big solution is to make better use of the people we've got. From a point of view of Construction Leadership Council, I hope you're familiar with the work of the council. I'm not going to ask people to put up their hands. I'm highlighting 3 of the work streams there. There are 2 others around sustainability and exports. But these 3 business models, the way we contract, the way we organise ourselves, skills and technology and innovation are clearly very closely related. And in terms of what the skills model is going towards, certainly there's a lot of focus on apprenticeships. I'll say that those apprenticeships are at the higher level, so the aspiration of the industry is not only degree apprenticeships, but degree apprenticeships delivered by Russell Group universities. So it's basically to break through the perception that construction is not what you might describe as an absolutely from top to bottom industry, and secondly the idea that it isn't a transportable degree skill. So that's the first one. Second one around career pathways, so again picking up and aligning with all the work the CITB, Build UK, Strategic Forum doing. And then I think this business around reducing attrition rates is so important. And I don't think it's necessarily a big problem for us, but if you think about the design professions, the amount of loss that you get through people just, whether it's through career change or just going off to other places, enormous level of waste. So if one was to try and sort of bring this together in terms of, I suppose, what the big picture needs to look like, and this is more, I suppose, a set of questions rather than a solution. I think the first one is that we need to really continue thinking about how we organise ourselves from a point of view of patterns of demand to actually sustain development of skills. So we spend an awful lot of time trying to build very long-term relationships with clients that we can develop solutions over. So I think that as a set of skills for the industry is quite important. I think then we need to be thinking about promoting conditions that encourage people to invest. And those conditions are probably not the kind, some of the sort of subcontracting models we have at the moment. And I think the point about asking organisations that are very small, 50 or so, to deliver most of the skills training in the industry is, it's realistic for the way that we work, but it's actually not a very sustainable model. So something thinking about what do we need to do, whether it's now or over the next 5 years, 10 years, to sort of change that sort of model a little bit, recognising that it's the most productive way of working at the moment, but we need to tweak things a little bit. And finally, I think it's then think about, well, actually, is the industry we've got at the moment going to be the industry that we'll have in 5, 10 years' time? It's fascinating. I don't think it's KPMG. I think it's PwC have invested in a drones business, initially in Poland. And what they're doing there is they've invested in a drones business to effectively automate asset inspection. So rather than having somebody go up on a ladder to see the condition of a wind turbine, do it with a drone. And the way in which that kind of intervention, new players, new ways of doing things, new skills, new capacity, is the future of our industry, not doing things as we've done before. Thank you.